And welcome to all you fire drill firefighters. And to those of you who are just joining for the first time, welcome to the Fire Drill Fridays family, where we're building community, learning about the climate crisis, and taking action to address it. You know, each of you can help our movement grow by sharing today's show, so your friends and colleagues can join the movement. So take a moment now and hit the share button. The more people who understand the gravity of the potential climate catastrophe and are willing to take action, the more chance we have to succeed in minimizing.
Movie night.
Because we want to spend more time building community with you, I'm reminding you that March 5th, 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're hosting the first Fire Drill Fridays movie night. We hope that it's going to be well attended, and if so, we'll continue doing it one Thursday of every month. Get your PJs and popcorn and join me and the whole Fire Drill Friday crew to watch Chasing Coral, a documentary about a team of divers and scientists who set out on an adventure to document the disappearance of the world's coral reefs. We'll stream the whole thing on our website and have a chat room to share ideas and questions. And after the film, we'll have a Q&A session with the filmmakers and me. Go to firedrillfridays.com/movie night to sign up. Time for some good news. As you may know, Deb Haaland, confirmed Secretary of the Department of the Interior. She is the first Native American to serve in a president's cabinet. Yay! Michael Reagan was confirmed as the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency. His mission will be putting forward aggressive new regulations to meet President Biden's pledge of eliminating fossil fuel emissions from the power sector by 2035. Significantly reducing emissions from automobiles and preparing the United States to emit no carbon pollution by the middle of the century. Here's another one. The town of Rawlins, Wyoming will soon be home to the largest wind farm. The transition to renewable energy is already creating jobs and much needed tax revenues in the county, so that's very important. And now I'll give you a little bit of personal news. Having been fully vaccinated, I made my very first trip in a year to Park Rapids, Minnesota. Oh, it was cold, to help raise awareness of the Enbridge Line 3 tar sands pipeline, which we've talked about on Fire Drill Fridays. And I believe that the trip was successful in that regard. I joined Winona LaDuke and Tara Hauska, both of whom have been guests multiple times on Fire Drill Fridays. It was a magical, well-attended press conference at the edge of a river with banners and huge puppets. Even a river otter came out to watch us. Then Lawrence O'Donnell gave me the last word on his MSNBC show last Tuesday, and that really got the word out. Enbridge is putting out multiple lies about having had all the required permits. It's not true. It shows that they're scared. Line 3 is one of a number of oil pipelines that the lame duck Trump greenlit before he left, and we have to pressure Biden to cancel the permits and require workers to be put to work in union jobs remediating the wells and the rest of the damage. Go to Stop Line 3, that's the number 3, stopline3.org to find out how. Maybe it's stopline3.org. That's how you find out how to do the writing to your elected officials, but especially to Biden. He could stop this. Now, before we go further, we really, really want to hear from you and learn what brought you to Fire Drill Friday today. No matter how many times you've come before, please answer the poll. You'll see it pop up now. It helps us make sure that we're getting you the kind of information that's most important to you and to the movement. Okay, now to today's topic. Over the last years here in California, we've had terrible rolling blackouts due to the wildfires and extreme heat. In Texas, the blackouts were due to the utility lines freezing when a record cold storm hit, because despite a number of prior such incidents and many warnings, The utility had never insulated their wires and pipes. They blamed the loss of electricity on the windmills, seemingly unaware that windmills function just fine in Alaska. I have friends who are renovating a house in Los Angeles and are well aware that there are going to be more fires, extreme heat, and rolling blackouts. You know, even if we start cutting back our carbon emissions, which we have to do, so much heat has been baked in that extreme weather events are going to get worse before hopefully they start to get better. Wanting to avoid being caught in blackouts and also wanting to reduce their electricity bills, my friends decided to install thin strips of photovoltaic cells on the parts of their roof that face south. That way they are electrically independent, and photovoltaic cells, also known as PV, transform sunlight into electricity. Like many of us, they hadn't realized that most utilities buy their energy from faraway places and transport it to where it's needed in their state, like SoCal, a large utility company for Southern California. It buys its wind and hydroelectric power from the Pacific Northwest and its nuclear, coal, and gas from the Southwest. See, that's why electricity bills are so high. Our power is so vulnerable. All that power being transported over aging transmission lines from so far away. The other main California utility, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, gets its energy from Canada, Utah, and Wyoming, and the Southwest. Whereas the renewable technologies like the solar panels that heat space and water and photovoltaic cells and the batteries that store the energy when the sun isn't shining, all these allow for individual or community ownership and control over their power, even in the face of natural disaster. And power they don't use can be sold back to the utility, to the grid. For more than a year, I've been learning that some green companies are replicating the same bad behaviors as the fossil fuel companies do. They often have weak human rights policies and practices. They look for resources in cheap locations that they can control and ride roughshod over the rights and health of local people. Here's an example. In Mexico's Isthmus of Tehuantepec, 2,000 wind turbines have been built and 3,000 more are planned. Now, from a narrow environmental perspective, this looks like a huge success, right? Not for the local community. In violation of their international rights, the local people were never consulted about this. Instead, the wind turbine companies ran roughshod over the territory's governing body, made contracts with small landowners and bribed local leaders, which has led to inequality and pitted people against each other. And to make matters worse, nearly all of the electricity produced goes not to the local citizenry to meet their energy needs, but to foreign companies, including the US-based Walmart. Now, obviously we're on a tight time frame that doesn't allow us to slow down the development of renewable clean energy. We need it quickly, but we need to hold energy firms accountable for their activities and the impact they're having on local communities in the United States and around the world. But I didn't see anybody calling attention to this travesty, sounding the alarm in a way that would rouse climate activists to action and alert communities to what they should fight for as we move away from fossil fuels to renewable. I mean, environmental justice has been rightly focused on the damage being done by the fossil fuel industry to low income and communities of color and tribal peoples. We've perhaps assumed that anything green would be good, right? Then I read Shalanda Baker's new book, Revolutionary Power: An Activist Guide to the Energy Transition, and I was ecstatic. Here it is, I thought, finally. There's so much truly useful and important things from the book for climate and civil rights activists, as well as home and apartment building owners to learn from, to know what to do from. Things we're going to have to understand going forward as we transition off fossil fuel. I had, for example, little understanding of the role that investor-owned utility companies play in making us vulnerable to the climate crisis. I read her book before the recent disaster in Texas. How they block our moves, these investor-owned utilities, IOUs, how they block our move to renewables, and how even after we've made the transition to renewables, they'll have the ability to continue the same old violence and economic exclusion of low income and communities of color, indigenous people, island nations. The same problems that these demographics have faced under the fossil fuel economy, unless we prevent them. Shalonda's book makes several central points. First, a country's energy system defines nearly every aspect of socioeconomics and health. In other words, our lives are on every level affected by the system that delivers us our energy. I mean, most of us don't even think about this. Second, the transition away from the fossil fuel-driven energy system offers an opportunity to overthrow existing socioeconomic inequality and create structural change. The climate crisis is demanding that we get rid of a centralized, undemocratic fossil fuel system that has for more than a century determined so much about our lives besides destroying the planet. We have to change, right? So why just change the energy part of it? Why not also change the centralized, undemocratic part of it, especially since the new renewable energy systems lend themselves perfectly to decentralization and democracy? We must do this, but it's not going to come automatically with the transition. We're going to have to fight for it. And Shalonda's book suggests that we should think of it within a broader civil rights discourse about inequality and justice. She says, and this is important, energy policy is the domain of the next generation of civil rights. I love this idea. And I think it's galvanizing, and I want to welcome, I'm so excited that she's here, Shalanda Baker. Welcome, Shalanda. Shalanda is the Deputy Director for Energy Justice in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to her appointment, she was a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University. She spent over a decade conducting research on the equity dimensions of the global transition away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner energy resources. She's the co-founder and former co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, an organization committed to providing technical law and policy support to communities on the front lines of climate change. Welcome, Shalanda. I'm so grateful that you're taking time to be on Fire Drill Fridays.
Jane, thank you so much for having me. I am really just thrilled to share the stage with you today.
Thank you. My first question is, your new book, The Revolutionary Power, an Activist Guide to the Energy Transition, argues that energy policy should be the next domain to advance civil rights. Explain that, flesh that out for us, please.
Absolutely. So I loved the lead-in. It was so clear and descriptive, and I'll add a couple of aspects to that. So we know that the energy system, as it is currently designed, has disproportionately impacted people of color and low-income people. We can see in the way that our fossil fuel generation is cited that Black and Brown Americans are more likely to live in the shadows of fossil fuel generation. So that has health impacts, that has long-term impacts in terms of life expectancy. I write about this in the book, but my own family has been impacted by the current design of the fossil fuel system. So that's one aspect of justice that is implicated by the structure and design of the energy system. The second aspect is really about the cost. And so we know that rates are set in a sort of flat way, which means that low-income people experience a higher energy burden. They're paying upwards of 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30%, $1 in $3 to pay their energy bills. And again, let me just remind you of my first point, which is they're subsidizing a system that is actively harming them in terms of health impacts. And just for a point of comparison, higher income folks are paying around 2% of overall income to meet energy needs. So this is an extraordinary burden. And I think there's an opportunity to lower those energy bills and lower energy burden. And because of this, people are making trade-offs about how they meet their household needs. There are homes and families that are, turning off the lights at night, opening stoves to warm the home, which is highly dangerous, and doing other workarounds in order to meet their energy needs. And so we're moving into this clean energy transition, as you talked about at the outset. And this clean energy transition allows us to reshape our entire energy system in service of those who have been so burdened by it. So we have this pathway, this once in a generation, once in a century opportunity to ensure that all the generation isn't burdening certain communities and that they're actually actively participating in the transition. We also have an opportunity to lower energy bills, which means money in the pockets of folks and actually wealth creation. So this is at the heart of what I mean. I mean, these are civil rights struggles. These are social economic struggles that are all implicated by this energy transition. And that's really what I meant by making that statement in the book.
You made it clear that fighting for a distributed local energy supply now forms a critical battlefront in the climate crisis. And you say it's playing out in one key policy area, net energy metering, NEM, it's referred to. And this refers to the ability of a business owner or homeowner to receive credit on their electricity bill for generating electricity from solar panels, like my friends mounted on their rooftops. So explain in what way net energy metering, why is this a focal point in this battleground?
This is one of the key battle lines in this broader transition. So we know that there were early adopters of solar, right? We can think about the 90s, maybe early 2000s, where those who had resources could put solar on their rooftop and lower their electricity bills. There were legislative and statutory incentives to allow for them to do that. So they were getting a 1-for-1 exchange. For every kilowatt hour they produced, they were getting an exchange for that. And that was when solar was pretty expensive. So we had a certain set of folks who were engaged in net energy metering. Now, over the last 5 or so years, we have seen a dramatic decrease in the cost of solar, which means that low to moderate income folks can now participate in that solar revolution. And just as it's becoming more available for those communities, the utilities and ALEC, which is the right-wing legislative lobbying group, among many other things, have put an all-out assault against solar, saying that more solar on the rooftops of households actually harms low-income families. And they're making the argument that those who are not participating in the solar transition are actually paying more or will ultimately pay more for energy because they have to maintain the cost of the grid. And so that's an artifact of, if that is true, and I think there have been studies showing that that may not necessarily be the case, but if that is true, it's an artifact of the regulatory design of our system. It's not inevitable that that will occur. Regulators could actually work to redistribute the cost of the energy system in certain ways. I mean, utilities are able to recover all of their costs and have an incentive to invest in infrastructure. When we have more people with rooftop solar, they're not getting they're not able to recover the cost of that infrastructure and pass it on to ratepayers. So this is a moment where we can rethink what's called the regulatory compact, where we promise investor-owned utilities a certain return, a reasonable return on investment, which flows to shareholders. And so the fight that's happening on the with respect to net energy metering is all about access. It's all about ensuring that low-income families, that moderate income families can actually participate in this solar transition. And there's a real role for regulators here. They have to be creative in ensuring that there are pathways for that participation, because as we have seen, the storms and the fires that are coming are going to make access to distributed energy generation crucial.
Thank you for that. You know, in the mid 1970s, I had a home in Santa Monica, California that was totally off the grid. I didn't have a furnace, it was all solar, and with a stove, and the hot air from the wood stove would heat up the whole house. And I had a wind turbine at my ranch north of Los Angeles. It was pretty great. Those were the days when Jerry Brown was governor. Yeah. So are there some utilities that are better or worse than others? And can you explain why? IOUs, for example?
Sure. Well, I really do go after investor-owned utilities in this book, and it's because of the sort of historic bad behavior that we've seen over the last several years, and because the business model itself is flawed. And so I'll give a couple of examples. You mentioned California, and you mentioned PG&E, which has faced criminal liability due to its bad behavior. That utility made the choice not to cut the brush around its infrastructure, and in the backwoods essentially of various parts of California. And as a result, that increased the risk of wildfires in the state. And their failure to maintain their own infrastructure has led to the devastation that we have seen in California. In the same vein, the utilities have permission to cut power preemptively to people in California when there is a risk of an increased wildfire, or when there is an increased risk of wildfires in the state. And so those are, again, economic choices that the utility has made, and in particular, the investor-owned utility has made, in order to save on costs and pass on more of the economic benefits to the shareholders. And so that's one problem with investor-owned utilities, particularly in this climate change moment. We also know that there is an incentive to invest in large infrastructure, and that large centralized infrastructure isn't the best type of infrastructure for this climate moment. Again, we've seen that in places like Texas. We've seen it play out in California. We need a more nimble system, and we need a nimble grid, and we don't need entities who are sort of incentivized to invest in that centralized generation during this particular climate moment. So there are a couple of alternatives. There are municipal power providers, and I know that we have LA municipal power provider, which is much maligned. I think there's been some management issues, but for municipal power providers, there's an increased transparency. At least the governance structure lends itself toward that, and this is something that is owned by the people as opposed to owned by investors. On the same vein, we have co-ops, rural electric co-ops that are owned by the people as well, and a group of citizens will vote the board into place to manage the system. And there are some downsides to co-ops too. I mean, they end up really locking into these long-term contracts, sometimes fossil fuel generating contracts, in order to keep the costs down for their members. So there are structural problems there, but one benefit is that they are member managed, member owned, and that also lends itself to greater transparency. In places like the South, though, where structural racism is a problem, I've heard anecdotally, and I haven't read any studies on this, but I've heard anecdotally that people of color and low-income folks are often left out of the governance of co-ops. So again, no single entity or approach to utilities is perfect, but I would put my money toward munis, so municipal power, as well as co-ops. I think the investor-owned utility model, unless we figure out how to govern it and how to regulate it in a way that is more socially beneficial, we're going to see continued problems.
What is the process whereby people in a county or can move from investor-owned to municipal ownership or co-op? What is it, a ballot measure, or what do you do?
Well, so in some ways it depends on the state where where folks are trying to make that happen. I mean, we saw a long battle play out in Colorado, and I don't know if anyone here on the line or watching is from Colorado, but the city of Boulder really tried to take a go at Xcel Energy over the last almost, I would say 6 or 7 years. And they started with a ballot measure that allowed the city to proceed with trying to buy out the utility's assets. But the utility, gets to set the cost. And so that's extraordinary. Of course, the courts come into play, and they also weigh in as to whether that cost is acceptable. And then the city has to raise the money in order to buy those assets. And of course, those assets are connected to a larger grid. So there have to be agreements to separate and segregate those assets off of the main grid and make sure that everything can continue to function. So it's a complicated process. There is a financial feasibility aspect of that. There's a technical feasibility aspect. And it's an uphill battle. So the community really has to be organized to be able to, participate. In California, you have a very active community choice aggregation community where, residents can come together through a government mechanism to sort of form their own buyer to be able to access other types of energy and not have to rely on the electricity that is provided by the investor-owned utilities, which predominate in California. So we're now seeing a little bit more innovation, but to answer your question about the process of transitioning to public power, it's hard, it takes a lot of organizing, and it takes tenacity. So, and unfortunately, the Boulder effort ultimately failed.
But it will ultimately win, I'm sure. I know those people in Boulder. In your book, you use the term carbon fundamentalism. Tell us what you mean.
Sure. So this term really goes back to my time in Mexico, and you described with such eloquence the folks in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca who were sort of experiencing this exponential increase in wind energy development without their input. And, all of that was happening in the name of averting catastrophic climate change. I had the privilege of working with communities in the Isthmus and working with scholars there. And also, I was a Fulbright researcher a few years ago, going back to Mexico to look at that country's energy transition. And I was in an interview with a high official at the Mexican equivalent of the Department of Energy. And I said, we've got to figure out these human rights violations. Indigenous rights are being run over in the way that Mexico is doing its transition. And he said to me, but Shalanda, climate change, which is to say that we don't have time to ensure that Indigenous rights are respected. And that, there's such an urgency to avert climate change, catastrophic climate change, that we'll worry about the equity issues later. And so that is really at the heart of what some activists call carbon fundamentalism, and what I like to say is climate change fundamentalism, where we're going to be fundamental about putting more green energy on the grid without making equity considerations a part of that discourse.
Thank you for that explanation. Can you explain to us decentralization when it comes to energy systems? Why is this so important going forward?
Sure. I mean, this is crucial. We need a more nimble electricity system. So we're entering a moment of unprecedented weather events, climate events, fires like we've never seen them before. And the way that our current system is designed, our energy system is designed, it's worked for the past 100 years. We haven't had these major disruptions that have ended access to power or disrupted access to power for folks. As we move into this climate moment, and we're already in a climate emergency, as you know, Jane, we need folks to be able to be resilient and to bounce back quickly from weather events. And we had a grid in Puerto Rico that was down for almost a year. I mean, this is mind-boggling, right? And those folks who had access to rooftop solar and batteries and fossil fuel generation, I mean, there were lots and lots of generators in Puerto Rico, and that was a whole different story. But they were able to bounce back, right? And they were able to sort of keep medicines cool. I did research in Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria, and we were interviewing folks who said there was one house that had a generator, and so we would all put our medicine in that refrigerator, and they would allow people to keep food warm or cold and that sort of thing. But for low income people, this is an extraordinary sort of civil rights concern, right? When the wildfires happened in California, when there was a threat of wildfires and we had public safety power shutoffs, the preemptive so-called public safety power shutoffs, right? And many activists don't like the safety part of that because, in fact, they were not safe at all. We know that medically vulnerable people no longer had access to power to keep their medical devices on. We also know that low-income folks couldn't replace medicines easily. So those, just went bad. And then, of course, what do you do if you have to pay for that out of pocket? That's a problem. We also know that refrigerators full of food, were destroyed. And if you're a low-income person, you get one check, you're on a fixed income. How are you going to replace that food? So these are, again, socioeconomic concerns. These are civil rights concerns that are all really connected to the centralized energy system and decentralized power, where we're not relying on an energy generating facility far away from us, but we're relying on energy generated in our own communities, can be one solution. And I don't want to oversimplify it. I mean, I do think there's a place for utility scale generation. There are places for that. As we move in the direction of accelerating clean energy development in this country, though, we've got to make sure that we're consulting with local populations, right? Tribes and other individuals in rural communities where a lot of that will be sited need to be consulted on day one so that the design and locating of that are consistent with the vision of the community. Yeah. But we also know that there's a place for distributed generation. Your friends in LA, right? I mean, they're already doing it. And it's not only rooftop, it's storage, and it's looking at community assets like churches, community centers, and hospitals and saying, can these community assets be the locus of generation to make sure that we can keep our lights on in these blocks? And
it could also be a source of income for the community, right?
Absolutely.
They could sell excess energy back to the, yeah.
Yes. And so these are all models that are on the table, and these are all possibilities, but a lot of the regulation of our energy system is happening behind closed doors, and people feel very, intimidated by participating in that process.
I know that you're an official and it's hard for you to talk about this, but do you feel that the people that the Biden administration is putting in place understand this? Biden has committed to dealing with infrastructure and all the things that need fixing together with the climate crisis issues, so that there are, anyway, you know what I mean. We'll be more resilient and more energy efficient. Do those people understand the importance of dealing with people's rights?
Jane, so again, I just want to say I'm wearing my hat as a professor who wrote a book, and that's where I'm here in that capacity. But from that perch, I can see the appointees. So of course, I have been appointed to join the administration. I've written this book that is pretty clear about, the justice implications of this transition, and the fact that I was asked to join the administration in light of my work speaks volumes. But then we can look around the administration, right? We look at someone like Gina McCarthy, who is a warrior, an architect of the Clean Power Plan. She came from, the NGO world as well, and she's a seasoned veteran. I've heard her speak. She's phenomenal. She's excited about issues of equity and justice. Her deputy, Ali Zaidi, he came from New York. New York experienced Hurricane Sandy. He was in the room as they crafted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is mirrored on which many of the president's commitments to communities of color, disadvantaged communities, are mirrored on those provisions. So the people who are in place are committed, And there are lots of folks. I mean, every day there's someone who calls me and says, "Did you hear so-and-so is now in the administration?" I mean, these are people from the movement. Dr. Cecilia Martinez is another one. She's phenomenal. She's a mother of the environmental justice movement, and she is in charge of shepherding the Justice 40 initiative, which is, the commitment to move 40% of the overall benefits of climate investments and other investments to disadvantaged communities. That's never been done before. And if there's anyone who can do it, she certainly can. And I'm excited to work closely with her as she moves that work.
Well, you make me feel very hopeful. Thank you for that. We're going to turn now, Shalonda, to audience questions. Maddie, I'm sure you have lots.
We have plenty. So Shalonda, this question is from Jerome on Zoom. How do we raise awareness about the importance of utility companies and increase the pressure on them to be better?
Yeah, I love to say this, and it's really just one word. It's organize. And it's organized and it's organized, right? Like you have to organize and educate yourselves and each other about, the importance of getting involved in regulatory proceedings, because regulators, they're overwhelmed. We have underfunded regulatory commissions around the country. And so they're often sort of taking every piece of paper that the utility says as gospel. And while we do have what are called consumer advocates, and they often sit in the Attorney General's office in the state, the consumer advocate is often underfunded. And so there needs to be a public voice in the room as the regulatory process is playing out. And it's so funny, I was on the phone about an hour and a half ago with a banker who gets regulation, gets justice, and he said, markets get created in the regulatory space. So if you want to market for community energy, if you want to market for low-income people to participate in this transition, you've got to be in the room where the regulations are drafted. And so that requires organizing and it requires education.
Thank you, Shalonda. From Fatima on Facebook. I just don't understand how PG&E is still operating as a utility company after everything that has happened, the deaths, the bankruptcy, all of it. Is there any actual accountability?
Well, I think the question answers itself, right? The system of utility regulation in this country does need to be fixed. And it really is mind-blowing how PG&E has sort of resurrected itself again and again. I mean, this wasn't the only incident, right? The incidents of 2018 and 19 were not the first time. PG&E has filed for bankruptcy before as well. And so the system is broken and it absolutely needs to be fixed. And I know that there were good people at the California Public Utilities Commission who were sort of working through the mechanics of how to hold PG&E accountable as it emerged from bankruptcy. But we've got two different systems kind of playing, two different flawed systems working together. One is the system that designs and creates investor-owned utilities and regulates them, right? So that's a flawed system. And then we have the bankruptcy code, which allows bad actors to go down and then emerge from the ashes sort of as if nothing ever happened and sort of write off debt and agree with major debt holders that it's going to sort of give them a haircut on their debt, but they get to continue as an entity. And so that erases the history, but I know for sure that people in California never forget and won't forget. And I do want to just put a plug in for a campaign that is actively working to bring more accountability to PG&E, and that is the Reclaim Our Power campaign. And it's a collective of folks. They're run out of the local Clean Energy Association. So Reclaim Our Power, if you just Google them, Pete Y. Woody is one of the heads there, Mary Rose Taruk, who's phenomenal. I mean, they're organizers who've been doing a lot of work. So please check them out as well.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I'm going to go right there.
Thank you. From Jacob on Zoom, what should I do to help with the energy transition? Does putting solar panels on my own house help? What if I'm not a homeowner though?
Yeah, so, there is what's called the split incentive problem, which means that landlords are not incentivized to do things like weatherization or put solar on rooftops because they don't reap the benefits, right? The individual in the home is the one who's actually going to benefit from those cost savings. And so again, I'm a lawyer. So, they say when everything looks like a hammer or looks like a nail, you use that hammer. So I think law is one route to this. I mean, we need to create a system that eliminates that split incentive problem, where if you're a landlord participating in the rental market, it's a privilege that we are offering you. I mean, yes, you have bought the home, et cetera, but in order to rent your home to people, you have to sort of do certain things, and we can create pools of funds through the state government to allow for landlords to benefit in some way from putting rooftop solar on or do weatherization. And for those landlords for whom this is their business, they should absolutely be required to at least do some weatherization. And so that's one way. And I know the question was coming from the perspective of probably the person in the home, but that's one way landlords and the government can help to really mitigate that split incentive problem. I would also say, as someone who is on the street wanting to make a difference, find a local organization. So my prior role was as the co-founder and co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice. And what we found in our work was that there are so many pockets of people all over the country who are organizing around this. And it is a home by home sort of effort, but we also need groups of people who are organized. Again, there's that word, to really move the needle in legislation and in regulation.
Thank you. From Kelly on Twitter, do you think there's room for bipartisan support of utility reform, especially on the state level?
I mean, see Texas, right? I mean, these sort of incidents that are going to happen or that have begun to happen and that will happen again and again really highlight the fact that the gaps in the system and the design of the system will affect everyone. They affect, Republicans, they affect Democrats alike, right? And so I think, unfortunately, it takes climate disaster to really get people in the same room. But I absolutely think that there is some promise there in terms of the bipartisan work around this. And of course, we're in the post-truth world, right? And unfortunately, that's a result of the last several years. But we have to know exactly, what is happening, and we have to be able to explain how the design is contributing to certain vulnerabilities and be able to tell the truth about that. And ultimately, the proof is in what the outcomes are, right? If people are still without power, if people are still very vulnerable, then it's harder and harder to make the case for centralized power. So I hate to say it, and I've said this in other settings, sometimes it takes a disaster for people to really wake up and realize that they need to make a change.
Yeah. I don't know if other people who don't live in California have experienced this, but when I use my phone to look at news, and there, how ads appear every so often. Well, there's one ad that keeps appearing that says, "Do not put solar panels on your roof."
Wow.
Fake news, huh?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten that one yet, Jane, but
maybe it's just since, PG&E has gone bankrupt and in such trouble, they don't want us to go to the alternative. It's fake news, folks.
Wow.
I'm sorry. Keep going, Maddie.
Thank you, Jane. From Diego on Facebook, Shalonda, which state has the best utility structure and which has the worst? And then larger scale, are there any countries that seem to be doing really well in this regard?
Diego, that's such a hard question. Okay, well, so, as the question was coming out, I was sort of scanning my mental Rolodex for states that are doing well. Vermont was actually ahead on a lot of these issues. The Green Mountain Power in Vermont is an investor-owned utility, but early on took a very aggressive stance with respect to clean energy and also taking care of low-income people in the state. And the former CEO, whose name escapes me, I'm sure someone in the audience may know, was a female, and she was just a pioneer in that space. And so she really worked hard to, bring more clean energy on the grid. And a lot of that was coming from Canada. So, that kind of is a double-edged sword, because a lot of folks realize that hydro is not costless in terms of environmental and social and cultural impacts, right? And none of the energy that we're getting from outside of our local community is without cost. And so we always need to think about that. But Vermont was really ahead for a while. I loved what was going on there. Even though there was an investor-owned utility model, they were creative. I would say in terms of countries around the world, we don't look south necessarily, but we're going to look to the east, to across the pond, to Northern Europe, and to countries like Denmark and Germany, who've been really aggressive with clean energy and the transition. And they realized early on that the only way they were going to get buy-in was to ensure that people could participate economically in that transition. So imagine, right, if you're a farmer, if you're an ordinary citizen in a community and a company says, we're going to do offshore wind here, or we'd like to put wind turbines on your property. And in exchange for that, it's not just a royalty. We're going to actually give you an ownership interest in the project. So that is the approach that, folks in Denmark, folks in Germany were, took. And the governments there really saw the opportunity for greater participation in the energy transition in those places. So I love the Northern European examples for that reason. And I think we could really learn a lot from that in terms of getting buy-in. I mean, we know that we are on a sprint to 2030. I mean, the IPCC report that came out a few years ago said we had a decade to make this happen. And for that type of scale of development, it can't be like Oaxaca. It can't be running over the rights of people. It actually has to be not only deep participation in terms of siting, but deep economic participation. It's not a soccer field. It's not a park. You're not going to, put different types of shingles on my local hospital. You're actually going to give me an economic interest in the transition. So I think that's the way it's going to happen quickly.
Thank you so much, Shalanda. From Selena on Zoom, how does all the investment in oil pipelines impact the transition to clean energy? Do you think the organizing to stop pipelines is changing the national narrative?
Yeah, well, I think when we saw DAPL and, Keystone unfold in the waning days of the Obama administration, we saw the types of coalitions form that we had never seen before, right? They were multiracial, they were multi-generation. We had veterans, and I'm going to get chills. We had veterans on the front lines, really protecting the water keepers. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment. The fight is to prevent this infrastructure that we know is going to go away, right? We know that it will become useless and defunct. We don't want to lock ourselves into that infrastructure. And the people, there's the Keep It in the Ground campaign. I mean, there are people who get that we can invest in technologies and resources that eventually will no longer be useful for us. And so I absolutely think that there is an emerging coalition. I mean, 350.org, I think, really cut its own teeth in that space. I mean, they sort of were holding a lot of that multiracial coalition space. And I don't think it's going to go away. So again, the beginning was, I think, 2018, 16, 17, and those coalitions remain.
Thank you, Shalanda. From Tatiana on Zoom, it seems like in many of these discussions, we're seeing a disconnect between labor movement and job security and environmental action. Why is this, and what can be done?
Yeah, well, so I would keep your eyes on the work that's going to happen in the Department of Energy. I mean, Secretary Granholm, again, I'm speaking as a citizen, has made a commitment to increasing jobs and also making sure that justice is central to the work of the administration. There are folks who are committed to kind of de-siloing those discourses. There is a real problem. We know that, transitioning communities are real. There are people whose livelihoods will shift and are under threat due to this transition. But we also know that there is an economic system that has not universally benefited everyone. And in fact, in many of the same transition communities, poverty is endemic, right? And so we are now moving into a new economy based on clean energy, where the goal is to make sure that everyone can win, right? Including those who've been harmed by the fossil fuel system, including oil and gas communities, and including coal communities, so that no one is sacrificed, right? Your environment is not sacrificed, your water, your health are not sacrificed in this transition. And so there's been a real commitment in this administration, at least, to bridge those different discourses and say, here's our dirty laundry. We've not done well by people of color in this country and Native communities in this country. And we have a pending transition happening in coal country and other oil and gas communities. And so we've got to put all of that on the table and really roll up our sleeves to deal with it. And I think the administration has just been very clear in saying, this is the work. And so I think the question is absolutely spot on. And for a while, labor was separated from a lot of what we're talking about, but labor is now central. You know, we're creating a new economy. And I like to think of this as our reconstruction. I mean, what a possibility, right? To reshape and rebuild our country in service of justice. That was the promise after slavery. We were going to do that. We had more Black people than ever in the Senate, right? Now we get a chance to sort of rethink our entire design. Our economy is going to change. And this is the civil rights struggle. We've got to make sure that it's created in service of justice and the people.
Yeah. Historically, the climate movement has not had a good relationship with labor. You know, keep it in the ground. I totally understand the need that's behind that, but keep it in the ground falls heavy on the workers that have good union family supporting jobs, and they don't want to lose them. Right. Because the green energy sector is not unionized. Yeah. So we have to recognize when we say, well, there's a lot, and there are a lot more jobs in the green sector, right? But those jobs are not at all equivalent with fossil fuel jobs. So those workers, it's some of the dirtiest, most dangerous work.
Absolutely.
That they've done. And there was a time when that was what was building this country. That Absolutely. Was what provided us with progress. It's not the workers' fault, right?
It's absolutely not the workers' fault. Yeah. I mean, they sacrifice their bodies and communities so that we could all have that baseload power, so that the grid doesn't fall apart, right? And so there is much owed to those communities. And I think there is an acknowledgement that those workers need a place in this new economy, and the workers in the green economy need to have high paying union jobs as well, right? Like, so it's a both and, you know, and I think we're going to figure it out, but all of those things are on the table.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Time for a few more questions?
I think so. At least one more question, I would think. From Lynette on Zoom. Shalonda and Jane, you are both such inspiring and strong women. What would your message be to young women and girls about the future?
Oh my gosh. Jane, do you want to start?
No, you take it, Shalonda. I want to hear what you say.
What would be my message? You were born for this moment. That's my message. There's a reason why you're here. You know, we're facing some of the biggest challenges of our generation, of this century, right? In recent memory. And we were all born for this. We're here for it. And so I would say, and I know this, Jane, this will probably resonate with you, that there were many times in my life where, you know, what I was doing didn't seem to make sense. And, you know, the arguments that I was making to major, you know, big green organizations and mainstream climate activists weren't resonating, but I kept at it because I believed in justice. So I'm now here for this moment. All the work I did up until now has prepared me to lead the federal government on issues of equity in the energy system. And it wasn't guaranteed that that would be the case, but I kept at it. And now I know why I have struggled for so long to make it to this point, because I was born for it. And so you were born to do your own unique thing in the world, and you have gifts to give. So keep at it and just believe that there is a greater purpose for you on this earth.
Women and girls are in the leadership of the climate movement. There's all kinds of reasons that we don't have time to go into right now why this is so, but it is so all over the world. I know it with Fire Drill Fridays. 2/3 of our audience, this was true both in DC and now online, are female. So that's one thing. We take the brunt of the climate crisis, and we're on the front lines of the solution for the climate crisis. And I can tell you, it's the greatest antidote to depression. I know that a lot of young people right now are grieving what's been lost, grieving what they know is going to be lost, grieving for a future that may not be so good for them. Put your bodies on the line, organize, not as individuals, join Sunrise Movement, join Fridays for Future, Fire Drill Fridays. There's so many organizations, but join the organizations that believe in organizing masses of people and getting them out into the streets. Extinction Rebellion. And they're so joyful. This isn't like eat your broccoli. This is joyful work. And you meet like-minded people, and we all need meaning in our lives. So join us.
Absolutely. I love that. Love it. Do we have any other questions coming in? I'm just curious.
I was just going to say, Jane, can we squeeze in one more question?
Do we have time? Let me just ask you a question. Could you briefly describe Hawaii? You've spent so much time in Hawaii. Tell me the situation in Hawaii that you've been working on.
Oh, sure. Well, I got to Hawaii back in 2014, just as the state was going through an extraordinary energy transition. And I had come out of work in Mexico, where I saw the human rights violations, indigenous rights violations happening there. And in Hawaii, people pay the highest cost for electricity in the country. And all of the dirtiest generation in the state is located in Black and Brown and Native Hawaiian communities. And so the work I did there, because again, most people there were saying, oh, we can do this transition, but we just have to switch the fuels and figure out the technology. And I was saying, if we're going to do all that, we also have to make sure that the poorest and the folks who are in the shadows of fossil fuel generation benefit. And so that began my activist journey, essentially. And I did a lot of work on the ground in communities. And by the way, for the person who asked, for advice for women and girls, I got shut down every step of the way. People didn't understand why a law professor was talking to grandmothers and aunts and uncles about energy. And I believed that those voices needed to be heard in the energy policymaking space. And the work continues. I mean, I'm now not doing work there, but I know that people are working hard in Hawaii for energy justice.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have to stop, Shalanda, but I hope that I work with you again in the future. And thank you so much for taking the time to join Fire Drill Friday. I wish you much strength going forward. You're in such a great position to help make all of this happen. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks all you in the audience for joining us today. By the way, if you want to get a copy of Shalanda's book, it's Revolutionary Power, an Activist Guide to the Energy Transition. I urge you to read her book. Now, we talked a lot today about why investing in clean energy is so important for advancing justice as well as boosting the economy. And yet through fossil fuel subsidies, our government is still funneling billions of dollars to fossil fuel companies each year, 20 billion to be exact. Instead of perpetuating a dangerous and dying industry, federal investments and all that money should go towards researching and developing and deploying clean energy infrastructure that will help marginalized communities rather than harm and pollute them. Go to firedrillfridays.com/take-action to sign a petition that demands Biden cut these fossil fuel subsidies out of the government's budget for good. We currently have 12,283 signatures on this petition. We need lots more before we deliver to Biden this April. So add your voice now, please. Finally, one more reminder about movie night. Next week, Thursday, March 25th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Looking forward to spending the evening with you all watching Chasing Coral with a Q&A afterwards with the filmmakers. You can sign up at firedrillfridays.com/movie night. See you next time.